"Mother, I cannot marry a fat duke," she cried, her voice ringing against the plaster ceiling. "I do not care if he owns half of Yorkshire and the other half of Parliament. I will not spend the remainder of my earthly existence making polite conversation with a man whose primary intellectual achievement is the capacity to consume an entire haunch of venison in a single sitting." She had not known he was standing in the doorway. That was the only fact Lady Cecily Vane would spend the next 3 months desperately wishing she could undo. She had been pacing before the fire, her copper-brown hair escaping its pins in wild, defiant curls, her skirts swishing against the Persian carpet as she turned on her mother with all the fury of a woman who had been scheduled, catalogued, and nearly sold without her consent. Lady Vane pressed her handkerchief to her lips. "Cecily, I am serious, Mother. I would sooner open a millinery shop in Edinburgh. I would sooner become a governess. I would sooner emigrate to—" A sound from the doorway. Not a cough. Not a polite clearing of the throat. A voice, low, unhurried, and carrying within it the particular quality of a man entirely unaccustomed to being either surprised or ignored. "I beg your pardon," said the Duke of Windermere. "I was told the parlour was empty." Cecily turned. He stood in the frame of the door, tall and broad-shouldered, dark-haired, not remotely fat, with an expression that might have been amusement had his jaw been capable of any movement less severe than a geological formation. Rain had dampened the shoulder of his coat. 2 small children clung to either side of him, not half hidden in the shadow of the corridor, their enormous eyes peering into the firelit room as if uncertain whether to flee. Nobody had told Cecily about the children, and from the careful blankness of his face, the Duke was very clearly aware of it. The fire crackled. The silence stretched, and Cecily Vane, who prided herself on never being at a loss, found, for the very first time in her 22 years, that she had absolutely nothing to say. England, 1847. The season is at its most merciless height, and London has declared, with characteristic cruelty, that this is the year Lady Cecily Vane must be married. She is 22, practically ancient by the marriage market's reckoning. The eldest daughter of a viscount of modest means and considerable social ambition. She is possessed of copper hair, storm-grey eyes, a sharp and restless mind, and an unfortunate habit of saying precisely what she thinks, at the precise moment she ought not to think it aloud. She has already refused 3 proposals. Society has begun to whisper. Her mother has, in desperation, accepted an invitation for the family to spend August at Windermere Park, the estate of Edmund Carew, Duke of Windermere, a man of 34, vast fortune, and a reputation for cold self-sufficiency that has kept every matchmaking mamma in the kingdom at a respectful distance since his wife died 5 years prior. What Lady Vane has neglected to mention to her daughter is that the Duke is a widower, or that he has 2 young children, or that Cecily is not merely a house guest. She has been quietly, and without her knowledge, proposed as a candidate for the vacant position of Duchess. What the Duke has neglected to mention to anyone is why he truly needs a wife, and it has nothing to do with loneliness. Edmund Carew is a man who has armoured himself in competence, silence, and duty so long he has nearly convinced himself he feels nothing at all. He does not expect the woman his household secretary has arranged to visit, so he does not expect her to be standing in his parlour denouncing him at considerable volume before she has even learned his name. He does not expect to find it, against every reasonable instinct, interesting. And Cecily Vane, who has spent her life insisting she will choose her own story, does not expect the Duke's secret to change everything she thought she understood about power, about freedom, and about the particular, terrifying courage it takes to love someone who is still learning to let themselves be loved. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us begin at the beginning, with a storm, a doorway, and a set of very small children who are about to upend 2 very stubborn lives. Windermere Park was the sort of house that had been built to impress people into silence. 4 stories of pale Derbyshire stone, so that it rose from its parkland like a declaration, all classical columns and tall, unblinking windows that reflected the leaden sky back at you, as if the house itself had decided you were unworthy of a warmer welcome. Cecily leaned out of the carriage window and found it thoroughly unimpressive. "It is very large," said her younger sister, Prudence, with the reverence appropriate to a girl of 17 confronting her first ducal estate. "Large things," Cecily replied, pulling her head back in, "are often overcompensating." Lady Vane closed her eyes and asked God for patience. Their hostess, the Duke's aunt, a Mrs. Dorothea Carew, angular and bright-eyed as a winter wren, received them in the entrance hall with warmth that suggested she was either genuinely kind or had been warned. "His Grace is occupied with estate matters," she said, guiding them toward the west staircase. "He regrets he cannot welcome you personally. He will meet you at dinner." "Perfectly fine," said Lady Vane, who found this neither fine nor perfectly acceptable. Cecily barely heard them. She had stopped at the foot of the stairs. Above her, on the landing, stood two children, a girl of perhaps 7, fine-boned and dark-haired, and a boy a year or so younger, rounder of face and currently engaged in attempting to fit a large wooden soldier into his left ear. Both wore the expressions of people who have been told to go upstairs and have chosen to interpret that instruction with creative latitude. The girl regarded Cecily with eyes of a particular, assessing grey. Then she said, in a voice of ringing clarity, "Are you the one who is going to be our new mother?" The entrance hall went very quiet. Cecily looked at the child. She looked at Mrs. Carew, whose expression had achieved the specific blankness of a woman aware she is witnessing a catastrophe she cannot prevent. She looked at her own mother, who had gone the colour of chalk. "I think," said Cecily, very carefully, "that someone has some explaining to do." She heard, from somewhere down the east corridor, the measured sound of a man's footsteps coming to a halt. She found him in the library. Not by design. She had intended to walk in the garden, to pace out her fury in the rain, which seemed better suited to her temper than the perfectly appointed corridors of Windermere Park. But she had taken a wrong turn, and then another, and had arrived at a door from behind which came the smell of old leather and wood smoke, and had walked in before she could think better of it. And Edmund Carew, Duke of Windermere, stood at the window with his back to her. He was reading a letter, his dark coat immaculate, his posture the kind that is not learned but rather grown into over years of understanding that one's position in every room is already established before one speaks. He did not turn immediately. When he did, he looked at her with eyes of deep-set grey, the same grey she noticed with a small shock as his daughter's, and waited. Cecily did not wait. Waiting was not among her accomplishments. "Your Grace," she said, "I have been in this house for 4 hours, and I have already been asked by a 7-year-old whether I intend to become her mother. I have also been shown to a suite of rooms that appears to have been prepared with some expectation of a prolonged stay, which suggests a level of prior arrangement that nobody has thought to communicate to me. And I should like to understand, if it please you, precisely what has been decided about my life in my absence." A pause. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice unhurried, "I was not aware you had been informed of anything." "That," said Cecily, "is rather the problem." He set the letter down on his desk with deliberate care. In the firelight, the planes of his face were severe, the lines about his mouth deep-cut. He was not, she observed with detached clarity, unattractive. He was also, evidently, entirely unaccustomed to being spoken to this directly. "Your mother and my secretary have corresponded at some length," he said. "I understood the arrangement was—" "An arrangement," Cecily said, "requires the consent of all parties. I was not consulted." The Duke studied her for a long moment. Then he said, with a precision that told her he chose his words with the same care he gave everything, "Nor, it appears, was I adequately consulted about what sort of woman would arrive." Cecily blinked. It was not, she realized, an insult. It was something considerably more unsettling. It was an honest acknowledgement. From a man who looked as though honesty cost him something. Before she could find a suitable response, the library door burst open and the small boy charged in, the wooden soldier now deployed against the bookcase. Neither the Duke nor Cecily moved. They simply looked at the child, then at each other, then away. And in that fragile, fractured moment, something neither of them had planned for had quietly begun. Their names were Marguerite and Thomas. Marguerite was 7, precise, and possessed of an opinion on every subject. Thomas was 6, largely silent, and communicated primarily through the medium of enthusiastic physical gesture and objects pressed wordlessly into the hands of people he had decided he trusted. He gave Cecily a smooth river stone on the morning of her second day. She was in the garden when he appeared beside her without warning. Stone extended, expression entirely serious. She accepted it with equal gravity. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and ran away. Marguerite found her an hour later among the roses. "Thomas gave you his best stone," she announced, sitting uninvited on the bench beside Cecily. "He only gives those to people he likes. He gave one to the first housemaid, but she threw it in the fish pond. And he hasn't liked her since." "I shall keep mine," Cecily said, meaning it. Marguerite considered her with those unsettling grey eyes. Then she said, "Aunt Dorothea says you are clever. Father doesn't like clever women. He finds them inconvenient." "How interesting," said Cecily. "And what does your father like?" "Quiet," said Marguerite. "And order. And nobody making things complicated." She paused. "We make things complicated. Tom and I. He told Aunt Dorothea we were worth any amount of complication, but he looked very tired when he said it." Cecily turned to look at the child properly, at the faint shadow behind those watchful eyes, the set of her small shoulders that spoke of a child accustomed to measuring words for their weight before speaking them. "How long ago did your mother die?" Cecily asked quietly. 5 years, said Marguerite. "I was 2. I don't remember her, except that she smelled like lavender and she laughed very loudly, which Father says was one of the things he loved best." The garden held that between them for a moment. "He doesn't laugh now," Marguerite added. "Not really. Not properly." She looked at Cecily with a directness that was rather alarming in someone her age. "Do you think you might be the sort of person who makes people laugh?" Cecily opened her mouth, closed it, thought of the Duke's severe, carefully composed face, and felt something in the vicinity of a challenge being issued. "I intend to try," she said. That afternoon, she walked into the Duke's study without knocking, entirely by accident, and found him on the floor, losing spectacularly at some invented board game to both of his children, till his cravat loosened, his composure entirely abandoned, and the ghost of something that might once have been a laugh still living in the corners of his mouth. He asked to speak with her privately the following evening, in the library, after the children had been put to bed. Cecily arrived to find 2 chairs drawn near the fire at a distance that was both entirely proper and, she noted, carefully considered. She sat in the one closest to the door. He noticed. He said nothing. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me several," she replied pleasantly. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who has spent years deciding how much to reveal of himself and has not yet reached a conclusion. "My wife," he began, "died of a fever in the autumn of 1842. Marguerite was 2. Thomas was 1. He paused. "They have not wanted for material provision, but I am aware that I am not always the father they deserve. I am better with order than with comfort, better with duty than with warmth. You were on the floor losing to them at a board game yesterday," Cecily said. He looked at her sharply. "I was not losing. I was strategically—" "The point is irrelevant." He cleared his throat. "The point is that Marguerite is about to enter the years when a young girl needs a woman's guidance. There are aspects of the world into which I cannot follow her. I need someone who will, be present in ways I cannot fully be." "You want a mother for your children," Cecily said carefully. Not a wife for yourself. I want, he said, someone the children will not merely tolerate but genuinely trust. And I have met a great many women in the past year who were willing. None of them. He stopped. None of them what? None of them sat on the garden bench with my daughter for 40 minutes and asked her one honest question. The fire settled. Outside, August rain tapped at the dark windows. I will not be managed, Cecily said. Not by my mother, not by a secretary, not by anyone who has decided my role before knowing me. I know, he said. That is, in fact, the difficulty. You are precisely not the sort of woman this was meant to work with. And yet here we are. And yet here we are, he agreed. She looked at him across the careful distance of firelight and chair and 6 months of mutual misunderstanding. Tell me, she said, what you actually need. Not what your secretary arranged. What you need. He opened his mouth to answer, and closed it again, as though the honest reply had arrived and surprised him with its own weight. Because what he had begun to need in the past 4 days was something he had not thought to put on any list at all. It was Marguerite who engineered it. She announced at breakfast with the unassailable confidence of a 7-year-old who has identified exactly what she wants and intends to have it, that Lady Cecily must see the Eastern Wood, and that father must show her, and that she and Thomas would be perfectly content with Mrs. Perkins in the nursery, and did not require accompaniment. The Duke looked at his daughter with an expression of weary recognition. Marguerite, father, you have the negotiating instincts of a Whig barrister. I learned from watching you, she said, and buttered her toast with supreme satisfaction. They rode out at 10 o'clock, Cecily on a grey mare called Minerva, the Duke on a bay gelding with the disposition of a scholar, which she noted with private amusement perfectly matched his own. He had expected, she suspected, that she would ride with the careful, decorative posture of a woman whose primary relationship with the horses was aesthetic. He watched her vault into the saddle with the ease of someone who had ridden since before she could reliably walk, gather her reins in hands that knew what they were doing, and set off down the park at a pace that made his gelding's ears go forward in interest. When he caught up with her at the edge of the wood, there was something alive in his face she hadn't seen before. Where did you learn to ride like that? My father taught me, she said. He maintained that a woman on horseback was the truest measure of her character. Mother disagreed. I sided with father. Your father sounds sensible. He was wonderful, she said, and the past tense sat between them without requiring comment. He died 4 years ago. Since then I have managed. Edmund looked at her sidelong as they entered the dappled shadow of the Eastern Wood. The light moved across her face in fragments, catching the copper of her hair, the set of her jaw, the slight softening of her expression when she spoke of someone she had genuinely loved. Managing, he said quietly, is exhausting. Yes, she said, surprised. It rather is. They rode in silence for a while, the comfortable kind that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having found someone with whom silence is not a failure. At the crest of the hill, where the wood opened onto a view of the valley, they stopped. The whole green sweep of it lay below, the river a ribbon of light in the distance, the house small and precise at the park's edge. It's beautiful, she said honestly. It is, he said, and was not looking at the valley. She turned to find his gaze already moving away, back to the distant house, but her pulse had registered the direction of it before he did, and she was nowhere near ready for what that meant. The Derbyshire neighbourhood called on the 2nd week. They arrived with all the social weaponry of the provincial gentry. Calling cards, studied glances, and questions engineered to wound through the precise mechanism of polite concern. Lady Harcastle, the most accomplished of them, fixed Cecily with a smile of calculated warmth over the drawing-room tea service. How delightful that the Duke has company, she said. We had quite given up hope of him marrying again. After all, a man in his position has certain expectations. He would require someone so very particular. So very— She paused with practiced delicacy. Steady. The implication landed. Cecily, who has been hearing variations of this species of condescension since she was 16, allowed it to settle before she replied. Indeed, she said serenely. I imagine he requires someone who can manage a household of his complexity, hold intelligent conversation, maintain her equanimity under the scrutiny of strangers who have formed opinions before making acquaintance. Shannon earned the genuine affection of two rather remarkable children, all simultaneously. She set her teacup down. It does sound quite demanding. Lady Harcastle's smile experienced some structural difficulty. Across the room, the Duke, who had been discussing agricultural drainage with the nearest magistrate, had gone quite still. Cecily felt rather than saw his attention shift, the way a room registers a change in weather before it arrives. Later, when the carriages had departed and the children had been extracted from beneath the large oak where they had spent the afternoon conducting what Thomas called important excavations, he found her standing at the drawing-room window, still in her afternoon gown, watching the last of the light. That was well done, he said. Was it? She said. I was rather afraid I'd been rude. You were precise, he said. There is a difference. A pause. Lady Harcastle has been attempting to position her own daughter in this house for the past 8 months. She's not accustomed to being outmaneuvered. I wasn't outmaneuvering, Cecily said. I was simply saying what was true. Yes, said Edmund, and in his voice was the quality of a man who has spent a long time surrounded by people who never do. That is rather the point. She heard him cross the room to stand beside her at the window. He did not speak again, but he stayed, and the last of the evening light caught them both in the same gold, and for the length of that silence, the distance between them was shorter than either of them had permitted themselves to plan for. She found the letter by accident. No, she had not been looking for it. She had been looking for Thomas, who had gone quiet, which, in her 3 weeks' acquaintance with the child, she had learned to treat with the same seriousness one gives to a very small ship that has gone very quiet in waters known to conceal rocks. She found him in the Duke's study, sitting beneath the desk in the manner of a child who has gone somewhere he is not supposed to be and has passed the point of easy retreat. She crouched to look at him. He was holding a sheet of paper, his round face carrying an expression of concentrated distress. Tom, she said gently, what is that? He held it out to her. It was a letter. She caught enough of it before she folded it away to understand its nature. From a solicitor, regarding the estate's guardianship arrangement, and containing the phrase that sat in her chest long after she had shepherded Thomas back to the nursery. Should His Grace remain unmarried at the expiry of the Trust's 2nd term, guardianship of the minor children passes to His Grace's brother, Mr. Aldous Carew, as appointed by the late Duchess's family. She understood it then. All of it. The arrangement her mother had negotiated. The urgency beneath the Duke's composed surface. The reason he needed a wife. Not for himself, not for social form, not for companionship, but because without one, he stood to lose his children. He found her in the garden an hour later. She did not pretend. Your brother, she said, Aldous Carew. He wants custody of Marguerite and Thomas. The silence lasted 4 heartbeats. His late wife's family put it in the trust to protect the children, Edmund said. They did not trust me to raise them alone. They may have had some justification at the time. He paused. I was not, immediately, the man you see now. After Catherine died, I was absent, from myself mostly. It lasted longer than it should have. But you came back, Cecily said. I came back, he agreed. They did not update the trust. She looked at him. This composed, difficult, careful man who had built his entire reserve around 2 children he was terrified of losing, and felt the ground of her own certainty shifting beneath her in ways she had not been prepared for. Why? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Did you not simply tell me the truth from the beginning?" He did not answer her question that evening. So he said it was late, that the children had had a tiring day, and removed himself with such practiced efficiency that she was left standing in the garden with his absence and her own rising fury for company. She gave him the night to collect himself. She was, at heart, a fair person. In the morning she went to find him. He was in the stable yard, overseeing the shoeing of a horse with the focused attention of a man who would very much prefer not to be interrupted. She interrupted him without hesitation. "You used me," she said, "or intended to, not cruelly perhaps, but used nonetheless. A convenient arrangement, a solution to your legal problem, and you allowed me to stay in your house, spend time with your children, and gradually—" She stopped herself. "Gradually?" he asked. "Become attached," she said, and the word costing her something. "Without knowing the full truth of why I was brought here." "I intended to tell you," he said. "When?" "When I was certain—" "Certain of what?" His jaw tightened. The groom had made himself very busy with a horse at the far end of the yard. "Certain," Edmund said, with the quality of a man pulling words from somewhere he does not often go, "that you would not use the information against me, that you are not another version of every person who has come here and seen the house and the title and the convenient problem and thought to leverage it." Cecily stared at him. "You thought I might threaten to expose your situation." "I did not know you," he said. "I know you now." "And what do you know?" He turned to look at her fully, and when what was in his face was not comfortable. It was the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not intend to go and finds it more true than anywhere he has been for years. "I know," he said quietly, "that you gave my son back his best stone instead of setting it on the windowsill. I know that you spent 3 hours in the nursery reading to Marguerite when she had a cold, because she told me, and that you made her laugh. I know—" He stopped. "What?" "I know that this arrangement, which was meant to be a practical solution, has become something I no longer know how to be practical about." She looked at him for a long moment, her fury still present but rearranged, sitting now alongside something that frightened her considerably more. Then she said, with extraordinary care, "I need 3 days. So do not speak to me about this for 3 days." And she walked away, and he let her, and that restraint, of all the things he had done, was perhaps the truest thing she had yet seen in him. She spent the 3 days doing things that settled her mind, riding Minerva hard across the eastern fields in the early morning, organizing the chaotic contents of the nursery bookshelves by a system she invented and Marguerite promptly improved, walking the river path at dusk until the sky went purple and the first stars appeared. She thought, with great deliberation, about what she wanted. Not what her mother wanted, not what society had decided she should want at 22, having already refused 3 perfectly adequate men. Not the arranged, negotiated, letter-mediated version of her future that had been drafted by other people's needs. To what she, Cecily Vane, actually wanted. She wanted the river stone, which she still carried in the pocket of every gown she wore. She wanted Marguerite's particular, measured way of considering a question before she answered it. She wanted the morning rides, and the library, and the fire-lit evenings when the children fell asleep on the sofa, and the house went quiet in a way that felt like peace rather than emptiness. She wanted, she admitted to herself on the second evening, leaning against the fence at the river's edge, the way it felt to be in a room with a person who was listening to her, not watching her, not assessing her, not waiting for her to perform, but actually, genuinely listening. She had not known until Edmund Carew how rarely that had happened. On the 3rd morning she went to find the children. Thomas was in the garden, adding to his stone collection. Marguerite was in the library, reading with a seriousness that was almost funny. "Do you want us to ask him?" Marguerite said, without looking up from her book. "I beg your pardon." "Father, do you want us to ask him to apologize properly? Tom is very good at looking tragic." "That will not be necessary," Cecily said. "I will speak to him myself." "Good," said Marguerite. "He is much worse at apologizing than he thinks he is. He needs the practice." She turned a page. "Also, for what it is worth, and Tom will agree if you ask him, we should very much like you to stay, not because of the guardianship problem, because of you." Cecily pressed her lips together against something that was threatening to become embarrassingly visible on her face. She put her hand briefly on top of Marguerite's small, serious head. Then she went to find the Duke. He was in the library. Where else would a man like this be when he was waiting to hear a verdict he was not certain he could bear? He was standing at the window, as he had been on the first evening she ever interrupted him, his hands clasped behind his back, the late August light laying itself across his shoulders in long, honest bars. She closed the door behind her. He turned. "Before you speak," he said, "I want to say something." "All right," she said. "I was wrong not to tell you the truth from the beginning. I justified it as caution, but caution, in this case, was another name for cowardice, and I prefer accuracy." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry. Not in the way I apologize for inconveniences, so in the way that I mean it." She said nothing. "Let it land." "When my wife died," he continued, his voice level and careful, "I went away, not literally. I was here, in this house, in this library, at that desk. But I was not present. The children were 2 and 1 years old. My aunt managed them, and I managed the estate, and I told myself it was sufficient because I could not—" He stopped. When he resumed, his voice was quiet. "I could not bear to look at them and not know how to be what they needed." "But you learned," Cecily said. "Imperfectly. Slowly." He met her eyes. "And then you arrived, and within 4 days, my daughter had told you things she has not told me, and my son had given you his best stone, and I—" He paused. "I found that I was jealous of the ease of it, of how you simply looked at them and they trusted you, and because they were right too." "Edmund," she said, his name for the first time without title. "I did not come here intending to stay." "I know. I came furious and uninformed and deeply resistant to the entire scheme. I know that too. And I find that I—" She stopped, gathered herself. She who prided herself on saying things aloud found, at the precise moment it mattered most, that the words were requiring something of her. "I find that I do not want to leave, not because of an arrangement, not because of a guardianship problem that I intend, by the way, to help you resolve through entirely legitimate legal means, without any recourse to coercion." She drew a breath. "Because of you, because of who you are when you are not armored, because of what you are trying to be." He crossed the room in 4 steps, not hurried, and not impulsive, but decided, and took her hand in both of his, with a steadiness that spoke of a man making a choice he intends to keep. "I'm not asking you to fix what is broken in this house," he said. "I'm asking if you would be willing to build something new. With me. As yourself. Entirely. Inconveniently. Magnificently yourself." She looked up at him. This difficult, careful, slowly thawing man who had, without either of them noticing exactly when, become someone she could not imagine the horizon without. "Yes," she said, "on the condition that I retain full authority over the library catalogue, which is currently organized in a manner that defies rational explanation." He almost laughed. Actually, almost. The ghost of it arriving in his eyes, settling at the corners of his mouth, as the beginning of something that had been absent for 5 years and was, now, returning. "Done," he said. And the library door, which Marguerite had left ajar by a precise 2 inches for the purpose of monitoring the proceedings, closed with a satisfied, definitive click. The morning room at Windermere Park had, over the course of a year, undergone a number of small revolutions. The library had been recatalogued on a system of Cecily's devising that combined chronology with thematic logic and a color-coded margin notation. that both she and Marguerite understood perfectly, and the Duke had privately decided was a work of minor genius, which he had conveyed by sitting down and learning it without being asked. Thomas had expanded his stone collection to 3 shelves, which had been formally designated his by ducal decree. Marguerite, who was now 8, had begun attending lessons with the vicar's wife on the subject of Latin. Cecily's suggestion met by Edmund with the swiftness of a man who had been waiting for someone to suggest it, and had declared herself satisfied that women were, as she had always suspected, perfectly capable of learning whatever they chose. The guardianship dispute had been resolved by means of 2 letters from a very capable barrister, and the intercession of a peer who owed Edmund a considerable favour. Eldest Carew had not visited since the previous autumn, when he had arrived to find not the solitary widower he expected, but a household in vigorous, warm, slightly chaotic operation, presided over by a duchess who had greeted him at the door and made it serenely clear, in the course of a perfectly courteous 40-minute visit, that the children were precisely where they were supposed to be. He had not come back. On the morning of their first anniversary, Edmund appeared in the morning-room doorway with the particular expression of a man who has something to say and has decided, after some consideration, to simply say it. "I was thinking," he said, "about the first evening you were here." "When I called you fat," Cecily said cheerfully, without looking up from her correspondence. "When you called a hypothetical duke fat, yes, without having met me. In my defense, I had not been told anything accurate about the situation." "Also in your defense," he said, coming to sit beside her, "you were entirely correct that the situation required your defense. You were simply magnificently imprecise in the delivery." "Magnificently something," he said, and in his voice carried the warmth that had been returning these 12 months, incrementally, steadily, the way a house reopens room by room in spring. From upstairs came the sound of Thomas's running footsteps and Marguerite's voice, imperious with the authority of elder sibling, telling him that he absolutely could not bring the large stone to the breakfast table and that father would agree with her. Cecily looked at her husband. Her husband looked at her. "He can bring the stone," they said, in perfect unison. Edmund pressed his mouth to her temple, a gesture that had become the particular private grammar of their life together, how he said the things he had not yet finished learning to say aloud. She leaned into it, and the morning room was full of light and the smell of coffee and the thunder of a small boy's feet on the stairs. Grass in the house, this great, cold, stone house that had been built to impress people into silence, was loud and warm and inhabited at last. She had not wanted a fat duke. She had not planned for any of this. She had found instead something she had not thought to want because she had not known it was possible, a man who listened, children who chose her, a life in which she was entirely, unmistakably, and permanently herself. It was, she thought, considerably better than a millinery shop in Edinburgh. If this story stirred something in you, dear listener, if you have ever refused to be managed, ever chosen authenticity over arrangement, or ever simply needed proof that being seen is worth the terror of it, then leave your thoughts below. We read every word. We love you for it. Subscribe to keep your place in the next story. The next heroine is already waiting.